Hey everybody, it's your buddy Pete A. Turner, executive producer and you might be a lucky guest. Hey, we have a really cool show today. I did an instant spin around and publish because our guest is Dr. Wilfred Reilly, who is a friend of the show and a friend of mine and someone I love talking to because he makes me think. He is part of a project called 1776 Unites, and that is started up and headed up by the Woodson Center, which is founded by Bob Woodson. And Bob Woodson is a wise dude and has been around a long time, and he does not take kindly to race mongers and race hustlers and that kind of thing. So they have now created a response to the 1619 Project, and that is a book called Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. There's that touch of Bob Woodson. Like no quarter on these things. So here's the deal. The 1619 Project is flawed. There has been retractions. There's been the New York Times stepping back. And in part of that, we have to say, yeah, okay. Historians have looked at it and went, you guys are kind of playing fast and loose with the history part. But to its credit, it started this conversation. And now we're all spending more time understanding that. In response to that, here is this indispensable guide going, hey, look, this is how we do it. And these are a lot of black folks writing this thing. So this is not just a bunch of white academics. This is people who understand this stuff and have legitimate academic credentials. Coleman Hughes is there. Obviously, Dr. Reilly. I can name all the list. Ian Rowe, John Wood Jr., Joshua Mitchell, John Sibley Butler. There's all kinds of people that you've heard of. Clarence Page, Shelby Steele, Carol Swain, Dean Nelson, Charles Love. All of these folks have written essays, and this thing's powerful. Here's how powerful it is. Even if you don't agree, this book debuted at, ready? Number 1 in the world. I'm saying that because it debuted at number 1 on Amazon. As I record this right now, it is still in the top 10 in the world for books. So you can look around. It's been number 1 in the Black and African American history category. It's been number 1 in the African American demographic studies. It's been number 1 in all of these different areas because this is an important book and maybe the most important book of the year. I mean, the 1619 Project won Pulitzer Prize. So this is the caliber of work that's being done when the 1776 Unites folks get together and do it. Hey, listen, when you buy this book, buy it through the link that's in the show notes. That would help me out. I'd appreciate that. When you look and you listen, it's always great to listen on YouTube. That helps out a lot. If you want to listen on the podcast side, that's totally fine. If you would want to support the show anymore, obviously you can buy shirts. I'm going to make stickers soon. Yay, stickers. But the other thing you can do is go to PayPal, or I'm sorry, not PayPal. Go to breakitdownshow.com, go to the PayPal link, click that link, and just do your own monthly subscription. And I swear to God, like if you're like, hey, Pete, I'm going to do $5 a month. Can we talk once a month? Can we talk once a week? Can we just chat every now and then? I mean, I talked to a lot of you already. And by the way, all of you who support already, thank you. I really appreciate it. You guys know how hard I work. I'm working late tonight because I'm going to get up tomorrow morning and I'm going to go get tomorrow's show. I had jury duty today. I work hard. And so when you're putting that $5, $10, $25 in a month, know that you're betting on a guy. You're supporting a guy that's going to work his ass off for you and try to bring you great content. John and I are right now working on our Tennessee trip. I've got a couple other smaller surprise trips that hopefully are going to work out. Fingers crossed, working on a lot of projects. That's where this money goes. It gets me out of the house. It gets me on the road because that's when I shine. Nobody can hold a candle to my field ethics, my field work. Nobody can. All right, look, I've talked a lot already. I'm really excited about this episode. I hope you guys dig it. I hope you guys appreciate that we're trying to show multiple points of view for very complex things. Slavery is a monster. Now let's really understand it so we can see that, hey, by the way, there's slaves being traded right now in the world. Right now. There's a real problem. So let's figure it out. Let's work on these things, but let's have a conversation that challenges us to think and to learn and to understand more. All right, here it comes. Oh, by the way, big shout out to Eric Hunley, who did me a huge favor while I was in court today. I was watching my own show and Eric did the hosting. Yeah, he actually wasn't here at all. He kind of played a couple of jokes. Eric does a great job in driving this, so I don't host this. This is Eric Hunley, and his show is awesome. Just type in Eric Hunley on YouTube and you'll find it, or go to his locals.com page. All right, Eric Hunley hosts, and our guest, as you know, is the incredible Wilfred Reilly. Save the Brave, SaveTheBrave.com.
Lions Rock Productions. This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
Is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Amy.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Will Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down Show with Pete Turner.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
I think we're live somewhere. I'm not really sure. Okay. It looks like Facebook deleted this. Well, that's nice. Okay. How's everybody doing?
Pretty good.
Now I've got to mute myself coming on this. Okay. Good times. Good times. Obviously, something went wrong. Now, Pete A. Turner loves to talk about spy versus spy. So this is going to be a pure espionage episode, and I've infiltrated the Break It Down Show. Name's Eric Hunley, and just remember, I was never here. And today, the guest is the legendary Dr. Wilfred Reilly. How you doing, man?
Doing pretty well. Glad to be back on the show.
It's good to have you, man. Now, I've seen in social media that you've been pretty diligently writing a book recently, and that book is coming out this summer, or you participated. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so the 1776 Unites initiative, which started as kind of the Black business and social science community, or at least part of its response to the 1619 Project, and since expanded well beyond that. I mean, if you go to 1776unites.com, I won't do our full pitch, but I mean, you'll see educational curricula, some policy positions, the scholars and activists that we have available, like our takes on race relations. But we decided to write a book. There's obviously a market for kind of racial discussion stories right now. I mean, Ibram Kendi's been #1 in the country at various times recently. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility is up there. And we're coming from more kind of a center-right, working world perspective. And we've gotten, a fair amount of donations, a fair amount of subscribers at 1776, about on par with 1619, I would guess, in a lot of regions. So we pitched out the book, and the book sold. And the book is a collection of essays about different topics, from John McWhorter's in the book, Carol Swain's in the book. I am myself, obviously, Bob Woodson, the kind of emeritus for 1776. But I mean, Coleman Hughes. And we talk about different things. I mean, what was America's history uniquely horrible compared to really any other countries? With slavery, the defining feature of American life, what should broad stuff? I mean, what should an American immigration policy going forward that would be a good thing for quote unquote legacy white and Black Americans look like? So a range of different issues on kind of race relations, class relations. But the reason I've been talking trash about the book online is that the book debuted #1 in, I'm guessing, the world. I mean, it would be on Amazon's global platform. Let's see where we are right now.
Yeah, you seem to be doing pretty well last time you shared.
Yeah, we're currently number 136 in the world. We're 136 in the category all books. But I mean, like, we're #3 in Black and African-American history, #4 in African-American demographic studies. We're right up there in terms of like all social science. So the book is something that went surprisingly viral for a lot of people. I mean, the whole #1 in the world. I'm sorry.
When does it come out? When does it come out?
It's out now. If you just go to Amazon, you can order it. And yeah, it's only been out for a couple of days, but I mean, we got 15 ratings so far. You can buy it new from the publisher for $25. We cover the shipping. A paperback. I didn't know we had a paperback edition, but I mean, apparently we went pretty big on this with Emancipation Books. Paperback is $17 if you get that delivered from Amazon. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty significant book release. I mean, it's one of the major books in the country right now. The question is, I guess to some extent, how will that be treated? Like in terms of 1619, The Friendly Rival, will you see the same glowing reviews in the New York Times and The Nation of these sort of black academics pointing out, the dry facts on some of this stuff. I don't know.
I somehow doubt it. I have a feeling the reception won't be quite as warm, and maybe that diversity maybe not quite as welcome since it's diversity of thought. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. That's for sure. Yeah, and you've seen this a couple of different times with this sort of content. I mean, well, one of the things with 1776, there seem to be more people that are interested in that kind of centrist, not leaning a little right, but not extraordinarily partisan. Like, what are the facts? Here's John Sibley Butler with the history essay approach to race relations than they are in kind of leftist guilt. Frankly, and that's empirically measurable. I mean, like if you look, we have an academic curriculum on our website, which focuses on talking. We talk about American history, a lot of which is pretty terrible. I mean, in the Indian Wars and so on, the atrocities on both sides. We talk about that openly. I mean, there's no reason to lie to kids in your society. But we also put that in the context of, look, women couldn't vote until the 1920s. This is what all other societies, Ethiopia, Japan, were doing. And that comes as a striking surprise to a lot of kids. I mean, I've had multiple minority American kids at Kentucky State say things like, these are smart kids at State University, but say things like, well, what other country had slavery? And you kind of have to break it to them peacefully, like all of them. What about our societies in Africa, the great black countries like Ashanti? Yep. So we provide that second element of, no excuses for this, but nobody had rights until, for the Geneva Conventions were in 1954. And then we talk about kind of the path upward that everyone has shared in the USA, not even just focusing on black people, like women's rights, the Irishmen, the Civil Rights Act for everybody, Jews, African Americans. So, I mean, there's been a lot more interest in that, I think, than there has been in the alternative. I mean, we've had 11,000 curriculum downloads, and as I understand, those are mostly from school districts. And what I've heard, at least, about the equivalent figure, because this is kind of like Mole in the other camp, I'd love to have them confirm what the number is. But the 1619 project, last I looked, was at around 3,000. So you have that interesting paradigm where there's this mass kind of slobbering attention being paid to this sort of politically correct upper class stuff. And then there's just this sort of boring social science with a bunch of, black businessmen writing it that is actually getting, 4 or 5 times the number of downloads or accesses. It's just, how do you crack the media sphere? Like, I mean, I do a lot of black media and I do a lot of Fox, but I've never gotten an MSNBC invite or something like that. You kind of wonder, like, will that happen? Are they going to give, Glenn Lowry a chance to go on and argue with, Don Lemon? Like, is that something that's going to occur?
Is it Don Lemon for real?
You're like Juicy Smollett, but they're French agents, I tell you. But I mean, but all this stuff, like, is that going to happen? Probably not. And I guess you could say the same thing about Fox in return. Like, is, Hannity going to bring on Tim Weiss? But I think that the comparison between, like, the presentation of this is the mainstream, black or Midwestern or whatever view, and the reality of, oh, this happens to be number one in the country for a week is an interesting one. And you can see the same. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you can see the same clash with anything probably from Rush Limbaugh to Marvel movies. Like, you can like or dislike the average American's taste. I mean, when it comes to a lot of things, I don't love it all that much, having traveled a lot in sales. But you can't ignore it in a democracy. So you often get this weird phenomenon where, like, I remember the Rotten Tomatoes, which aggregates all the critics. They don't have much of a citizen voting section. They rated 2 comedy specials in 1 year. And I watched both of them. I'm a big fan of comedy. But one was Dave Chappelle, like the OG doing his thing. This is the one where he talked about the alphabet people. And like he made fun of poor whites and Republicans too, but just like a bunch of these gay jokes. Like it was very politically incorrect. Sure. And the citizen vote for that was 99%. This is hilarious. He made fun of everybody. The critical vote was like 23% positive, like Dave's off his feed. And like you knew why. But the next one was Hannah Gadsby, like Ain't I a Woman or whatever it's called. And I am a feminist in the second wave sense. Like my girl liked it. Like it wasn't that bad. It didn't make me want to, jump off a roof or anything. But it was like, I would have given it maybe a C. And that's what the citizen vote was. It was like 37%, like, okay, she takes too much trash from right-wing media, but this isn't very good. Polish up your jokes, learn to do callback jokes. And then you had the critics, 98% positive. And you kind of had to wonder, how could you get to that perspective? Like, even if you think it was okay, which I kind of did, it's not very good. It's not as funny as Dave Chappelle. Very few things are. So you see this a lot. There's not really a point here other than that when you look at media on either side, but remember, it's 90% dominated by one side, recall what you're getting. That may not be much of a reflection of reality. And, go buy my book.
Oh, there you go. Speaking of books on that and a lack of knowledge of history, I'm from Tucson, Arizona, which is I grew up in a fairly, I don't know if you say leftist school, but in the 80s, post-Vietnam, Depression, Reagan was evil, all that good stuff. And I essentially was taught that Columbus came here to Jamestown with the Pilgrims. It was like this whole mass of history, like 200 years just wiped out, that I had no real idea of, and actually got caught up with Tony Horowitz's book, Voyage Long and Strange.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've ever read that, but it's so fascinating how little history we actually do know or are taught in, our country and everything that's going on. It's kind of flabbergasting.
Yeah. And I think not to both sides this too much, but I think there are two kind of uselessly negative perspectives. Like, one is what you could call the jingo perspective. And I mean, up through the Roosevelt era, probably certainly in most Caucasian majority schools through the 1950s, you really did learn this narrative of like America, the greatest country that's ever been launched, and there's no competition. We didn't do nothing wrong. Slaves, we taught them barbarians about Christianity. And I mean, obviously that's not my take, but that was the presentation for quite a while. I mean, the Rough Riders going up San Juan Hill, just whole periods like the Depression caused largely by government mismanagement were dramatically minimized. So that's the jingo take on U.S. history. Like, we're the best, we're number one. The ultimate example of this would be the Thanksgiving illustration of like all the Pilgrims and Indians, none of whom are pictured as having weapons. Like women are fully active in society and they're all dancing around a fire together. That's the first Thanksgiving. That is the kind of take that we traditionally gave to at least younger children. And in response to that, I think you've seen sort of this America with 3 Ks take, like America, KKK. Our history is the brutal repression of, the indigenous tribes who were so civilized they actually inspired our government, and slavery built all of the wealth of this country and so on. And that really, if you read, like Howard Zinn, for example, has put together 3 or 4 history texts that are based pretty much just around this idea. A people's history of the USA, a people's history of the world, using people in the communist sense. I think both these takes are complete bullshit. I mean, the reality is that most things are very complicated. So in the modern sense, I mentioned the Geneva Conventions, we didn't have international law banning conquest until after Hitler. I mean, you're talking about 1950 or so. The League of Nations tried, but most of the major countries, including us, didn't even join. So when you look at history, you're looking at it in that context. The native tribes were Bronze Age, being lenient there, warrior peoples who were extraordinarily honorable in many cases in our sense of the term, but who fought constantly. There were societies like the Iroquois that were pretty civilized and had some democratic traditions. There were others that were ruled by war chiefs. And I mean, when the white and black settlers came to the USA, I mean, there was constant raiding back and forth between the two sides, which made the wars that followed pretty much inevitable. I mean, we can present this in some guilty sense as killing the Indians. But the reality is that if 800 Mohawk warriors, I mean, some of the greatest fighters in history, swarm over the palisade of one of your towns, kill all the men and rape all the women, like, you're going to round up an army and go after them. And then there are going to be atrocities on both sides, and the fighting's going to continue for a while. There's a Mohawk reservation today. So presenting that more complex picture of this is what happened. Sometimes we were at fault. Sometimes they were at fault. Every treaty that I've ever seen between the USA and another power, whether that's Spain or a great native nation, was broken by both sides. Like, that kind of real history, you get into more as an adult, but you can't help thinking that that's the truth. And you also can't help thinking that to the extent that we can, that's what we should be teaching, certainly in middle school or high school. But people often prefer these sort of two extremes, where the alternative to the 16
side that you can pick, you're on this team or that team. And you brought up a great point. I can't help but think about the Lakota, who were called the Sioux. And where did the term the Sioux come? Where did that come from? That came from all the other tribes in the area that called that tribe the Sioux, which is essentially little rattlesnake.
Yep.
And that's where, I guess, colonialist or whatever we were, learned the term, and they conquered everybody around them for generations after generations. So that is a good question. When we look at all of it, everybody's kind of guilty, but then there's no nuance. You're right. Who do you pick? Who's your team?
Yeah, the Sioux thing is interesting because, I mean, that came from their most significant group of opponents, I think, like the Anishinaabe Coalition. The other nickname for them was the Torturers. And if you actually read about the history of most peoples prior to Western arrival, I mean, it reads pretty much like, I'm assuming, the history of the Western Bronze Age did. You had warrior tribes, these great chiefs fighting constantly. It's very, very hard to squeeze it into a politically correct bucket. So, yeah, I mean, when the white settlers arrived, a bunch of different things happened. I mean, certainly there were, ambitious, brutal men. Most successful males are pretty amoral, who just moved west and moved the Indians out of their way. But there were also people who signed treaties with the Indians to, as they thought, take possession of some land from the chief and start homesteading, only to find that the Indians had no intention of obeying these treaties, or that the chief was a good guy, but he couldn't control his young warriors, the braves. So you'd have a skirmish with a raiding band. And again, this is European history through the Viking era. You'd have a skirmish with raiders every couple of weeks. And all of this went on for the Indian.
There's another one too. Another group. You've been on with Thaddeus Russell on Register, I believe. He writes about in Renegade History, there's a third option. And that was a lot of settlers said, you know what? We want to run around and play. And they essentially left and joined the tribes.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a problem too. So nothing is clear.
Yeah, the native tribes at the time, and say 1840, when they were still sending warriors into the field against the whites, I think a lot of them, certainly if you look at, quote unquote, the 5 civilized tribes, wouldn't have looked much like the stereotypical depiction of an Indian in the Western movies. Like, how? Guy with the old feather bonnet, which is generally worn just at ceremonies and so on. I mean, a Cherokee fighter would have been a guy wearing something that looked almost like a turban, maybe wearing a mixture of Western and native clothes, carrying, a modern rifle, with his sons and probably a couple of his slaves accompanying him to the camp. I mean, that's another thing that was rarely mentioned. Yeah. Like the native tribes adopted slavery. Most of them already had slavery, but quite a few enhanced the practice when Westerners got here. So the Cherokee Nation was known for ownership of a very large number of black slaves. And there's still a discussion about this today. What's the status of, quote unquote, the black freedmen within the Cherokee state? And there's some racial bias on both sides. I'm sure
on that. And I'm sorry, I keep jumping in, but you keep popping things in my head. But Henry Gates did a thing on genealogy talking about the Cherokees and blacks, and that there's a belief within, I guess, as he put it, black culture, that everybody is descendant or part Cherokee. Have you ever looked into that or read up on that?
Well, the reason for that, that's true for want of a better word, poor whites too, working class white guys in the South. Like, everyone's part native. And if you ask them what native tribe, but probably, I did this once with my friends as a joke, and it was like 95% of the time it was Cherokee. The reason for that is that the Cherokee were a nation. I mean, there were several 100,000, I think would be the correct term, quote unquote, pure blooded Cherokees. And they had pretty extensive admission policies. I mean, so if you were black and you were something like a blacksmith, you've been captured as a slave and you ended up in Cherokee society, my understanding is at least your kids would probably be free. Like, there'd be some racial prejudice against them, but they would be treated as Cherokees. It's the same thing with whites. You could be adopted into the Cherokee Nation. Now, today, they're actually a lot tougher on this, because there was an issue for years with what you're describing. Everyone in the country, every white liberal or every brother saying they were Cherokee.
Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah, and the Cherokees started asking, is there any proof of this? And I think you can't help but think that some of these high profile cases probably enhance that. Where, like, Ward Churchill, the lunatic left-wing academic, identified as Cherokee for many years, Kituwa Band. Elizabeth Warren, who, I mean, literally is blonde-haired, blue-eyed, said she was Cherokee. and started contributing to books with names like Pow Wow Chow. And at some point, the paramount chief must have just said, this is BS. I mean, so right now, I mean, you do need to have some kind of genetic testing, as I understand. You do need to have like an identified stomp grounds. You need to be able to say, I am an Indian. But, I mean, I might or might not qualify as a native tribesman. It's never been something I've been particularly interested in doing. I respect that part of my heritage, but my ID is black. But I am, at least from the family records, part Indian. I mean, I think a lot of people were getting into Warren claimed, I think she was 1,068th Cherokee. So the Cherokees are now, like most of the native tribes, getting a little more specific about genealogy. But for years, the larger East Coastal tribes, particularly the Cherokee, would adopt pretty frequently. So yeah, that created that myth where if you run into people in the Southeast, they're very likely to say, you know, I'm part Indian and it's this group. So interesting kind of historical quirk there.
Well, cool. Now, who put this group together?
Oh, you're talking about 1776
Yeah.
I was going to say the Cherokee. I mean, it would be the paramount chieftain Sequoia. But the 1776 Unites really was kind of the brainchild of Bob Woodson, modern Cherokee. I'm sure they have lived in Cherokee in that region for thousands of years. But Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center was the person who came up with the idea of 1776 Unites. And he reached out and got in contact with the people involved. And it really is, I mean, a pretty heavy hitting think tank lineup. I mean, I would put, you know, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, Coleman Hughes, Carol Swain, John Sibley Butler, you know, John Wood, the rest of the lineup. I can actually pull up our scholars on the website. I mean, that's like the top 5. I'm not bad. You know, I mean, so it's that group, which I'd put on par with pretty much any think tank in the game right now, was assembled by Woodson. And the idea initially, as I said, was a response to 1619. I think there were 2 components of that. One is just pointing out some actual factual errors in the original materials. I mean, some of which were quite well put together, but others of which included things that aren't true in a pretty uncontested sense. I mean, the obvious example that's been seized on a lot in left and right-wing media is the Revolutionary War was fought to increase unfreedom. It was fought to preserve slavery. That's simply factually inaccurate. I mean, there were conversations about eradicating slavery in Britain at the time, but slavery wasn't ended in the overseas colonies until, as I recall, 1833. I mean, that simply wasn't a major motivator. I don't know a historian that disagrees. But just so on down the line, everything unique in American history came from slavery. I mean, that would be hard to tell that to an Irish or Mexican immigrant. I mean, that doesn't seem to make any sense empirically. We have another wave from South Asia right now, California cuisine, the space program. I mean, that's, again, not factually true. There's not much of a discussion there. Slavery is what made America rich. I believe the quote is the thing that enriched New York and the nation. It could be a few words off. Again, slavery made slave masters rich, but you have to deal with 2 facts if you're making that claim.
I think there's definitely people who dispute that. I mean, in the Civil War, for example, the Irish were very much against the slaves being freed, the Irish in New York, because they don't want their jobs taken. So there was a lot of levels that were there. Also, I'm sure you've read Thomas Sowell.
Of course. Almost
what
literally
do you think
all
of his? Okay, what do you think of his overall thesis that racism was created as an excuse for slavery versus the opposite?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. First of all, I would tend to suspect that racism under less scientific form, I mean, as I recall, the Mongols had a distinction between like riders and then captured people and then farmers they thought were fit only to serve. I mean, so I think racism has endured as long as there have been humans. What you're doing is making in my opinion, fairly silly distinction between tribalism based on race and racism, which has an element of sort of quasi-scientific eugenics. Racism in a fairly real sense, Greeks and the Persians, is probably as old as man. So, but I mean, I think the enhancement of racism in the Western context, I think Sowell's probably right about that. But Sowell is also one of those people who talked about this point about the complex, but not in general beneficial nature of slavery. I mean, in terms of the claim slavery made America rich, Sowell points out, and I think race and culture, that if you look at the South in the antebellum era, like right before the Civil War, the South had a population that was fairly comparable to the North. I mean, the Confederacy contained 10 plus states. I mean, a large number of people, but their economy was vastly smaller than the North's. I mean, they had between a fifth and a tenth as many factories, as many literate workmen, so on, because of this reliance on feudal peon agriculture. So you can say that slavery contributed to the wealth of the country in a very technical sense, and that we in the United States needed cotton, and cotton grew in the South, and they happened to have a lot of slaves that picked the cotton. But the response to that is using anything other than captured enemy warriors to get that cotton in, whether you're talking about machines, whether you're talking about free labor, would have been more beneficial for the country. I mean, people have pointed out.
Didn't Tocqueville write about that around the, I don't know, early 1800s, saying that the South is going to die because they're lazy?
Yeah.
He stood on the river and said, look, we got industry here. We got lazy people over there.
Yeah, it literally was a fascinating example. Southerners still hate this, but he's talking about it's idle Kentucky, the almost parable. He's talking about he's on a boat or a steamboat or whatever they would have had at the time. And he's going down the river. And on one side, you see these well-built brick kilns and factories, and smoke is coming out. And on the other side, I mean, this is cleaning it up a little, but you see a mix of white guys and black guys sitting in fields smoking, corn cob pipes. You see what we think of as that hard scrabble Southern agriculture, like small fields tilled almost Swidden style in between basically wilderness. I mean, like Arkansas's state mascot has been the Razorback for decades plus because the area was full of these wild hogs. People would just turn their pigs out to kind of feed themselves. It could mean anything from acorns to small children. And they would just run around. These things, I'm not kidding. These sounders of pigs were very dangerous. Travelers were encouraged to walk with their gun or their sword out because they could be attacked by all the wild pigs and dogs and shit in the area. So, I mean, but it's easy to make fun of this, but that is an example of how feudalism impoverishes areas. Again, in the USA, because we have such a strong moral conscience, we're a democratic country. We come out of that somewhat puritanical middle class space rather than having traditionally been led by nobles. We tend to view the things we have done that are bad as unique human evils. We go almost apoplectic apologizing for them. In reality, there are a few new things under the sun. The Indian Wars occurred because young male warriors on both sides kept raiding one another. That is an extraordinarily old human phenomenon. It goes back, thousands of years before Lindisfarne. If you look at the history of England or Norway or the coastal African states, blah, 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 same thing. But similarly, slavery is just an enhanced form of feudalism. So throughout most of history, the way societies worked is that you have one rich son of a bitch who owns a big house and who lives in that big house in the middle of the best arable land around. And then you have a subclass of his warriors and their wives. Overseers is a term that's been used in more than one society. But men-at-arms would work just as well, cowboys, knights. And then below that, you have a group of people that don't really want to work very much. Slaves are people that have generally been captured in war by their enemies. The other alternative would, and that's how the Bantu warriors came here. The other alternative would be serfs, which are people that are sort of bound to the land. Like, you're technically free, but you ain't going anywhere. You owe a debt of whatever. This is what a peon is. The same system occurred south of the border. It accounts for some of the slowness of development in Mexico. But I mean, you owed some unpayable debt to your lord, or just your skills were farming and blacksmithing, and you couldn't leave your land to do them anywhere else because there weren't any cities, and the next, baron already had some farmers and a blacksmith. Anyway, that's what you had in the South. And one of the effects of these kind of feudal systems is that work becomes devalued. If you're a slave, unless you're a coward, you're going to want to do as little work as badly as possible. And screw these people. They caught you just because your side lost. To hell with them. You don't want to help out the white man's agriculture. And the same thing I assume would be true to to an even greater extent if you were a poor white. You would feel that you were doing slave work in the South.
On that note, with the white, the black, and all that now, I have read, and you could probably confirm more because I know you're way more well-read on all this than I am. The reason why African slaves were even brought in is because the white slaves were dying. No, they're not slaves, but the white indentured servants were dying because of malaria in the South, and they had a really, really tough time of it. So they went to Africa where there was a degree of ability to fight the disease, if you will. Have you ever heard any of that, or no?
Yeah, no,
I'm not excusing it.
That's roughly correct. Of course. So just to say the obvious, because we were both reasonably prominent at this point, and people, watch this stuff with the intent of criticizing. I mean, obviously, neither of us is excusing slavery. Slavery is bad. Don't you agree, Eric? You know, like slavery.
Absolutely.
That's right. In general, feudalism is a bad, ineffective system. Now you could ask, obviously you don't want slaves, but you could ask, is there another way of organizing some of these historical countries? When you get into Russia or, Mali over in the Black Lands, given the level of technology that's available, do you have an option other than barons or telestai or whatever you decide to call them? And the answer might be probably not. But under modern conditions, yeah, sure, feudalism is bad, slavery is bad, but that's not really the point. The point is there a specific, unique evil to what we engaged in the West, or were blacks captured because of something, some inherent genetic weakness on the part of either blacks or whites or anything like that? And the answer is, of course not. No. Slavery is something that's endured across virtually all human societies. So what you had in the USA first was people that are sometimes called slavees, sometimes called 23 years, most commonly just called indentured servants. But you would bring in people from Scotland or Ireland or whatever. I mean, the poorer parts of the British Isles. You've seen Braveheart. They were pretty poor. The potato famine had occurred around this time. And these people would commit to, in exchange for being brought to a country where there might be food and work, would commit to working for you for a long period. I mean, 7 years was at the lower end, 14, 23 were very common. Bear in mind, people at this time lived to be about 30. So this was actually a fairly effective quasi-slave system. It's technically accurate to say things like, well, Irishmen were never slaves in the USA. Correct. They were indentured servants who couldn't leave Massa's farm for 23 years. It is a subtle distinction, but it is a distinction. Your kids would probably be free. Like, I get it. But if you're the actual guy out there picking cotton, getting hit with a whip, it probably feels pretty technical to you. Anyway, the problem with this is that those people, I don't know to what extent this is genetic as versus cultural training. I think there's a lot of pseudoscience around race. But I mean, those people came from a colder climate. There were different diseases. So both white and native non-slaves tended to die pretty rapidly under these conditions of Southern plantation agriculture. And there was a shift toward black slaves. And there are two variables there. One is that African Americans, frankly, come from a climate in West Africa that's pretty similar to what you got in the deep South in Latin America. I mean, it's deeply creepy to us to think about selecting like your slaves for the sort of property you have. So you might have, white men in the North and so on. But this is what you would do if you were, the baron. You were one of these large corrupt landowners. That's one reason for the advent of black slavery. There are two reasons why Africa became a focal area for slaves. One is that, considering where the slaves were going to. The other is, I'm sorry?
A lot of supply, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, a lot of people, there were a lot of wars at that time. Africa was perhaps a few hundred years behind in terms of technological development. So not like a land of kings, as Hotep's claim, also not, rock-throwing savages, as you sometimes hear on the far right. But maybe if you're looking at Ashanti sort of at a high medieval level of development by the time the whites had gotten around to steamboats and so on, mainly due to isolation. So you had kingdoms that were expanding inland at the time that the Caucasian and Arab countries needed a supply of slaves. So the African kings were more than willing to sell these slaves. This, again, is something that's absolutely uncontested in history. I mean,
that's their enemy. I mean, it's a convenient way to get rid of an enemy. I mean, it's wasteful to kill them if you could just make them go away.
Yep. In an absolutely horrible sense that we are not endorsing, slavery is a step up from what existed prior to slavery, which was genocide. So if you were a conqueror in the sort of pre-Roman era, if you defeated another tribe, there was no use for the males. I mean, generally, you'd give them sort of a chance to die with honor. Everyone would lean their head over the block and you'd chop it off with an axe or something like that. It wasn't necessarily very brutal, but there was no use for spare men. Unless you're going to quote unquote geld them, which is a disgusting process a lot of people didn't want to engage in. You can't have a bunch of unfree males standing around with axes and hoes and other potential weapons in their hands. So they were just killed. It was only when large scale estate agriculture became possible with that entire system of overseers and so on, or at least some laws regulating slavery, that men who had survived a battle were kept alive at all. Women, I assume for various other reasons, were often allowed to live. So, I mean, in Viking society, you had the captured, quote unquote, English brides and all that. But Slavery evolved out of the previous practice, which in many cases across all races was killing and eating your enemies. So it's very easy to criticize that's barbarism, so on. But you're criticizing a particular point all along the trajectory of history. Like, rather than enslaving opponents, would you prefer that, the historical kings or the black ones in Africa just killed them all? Anyway, that's one of the reasons so many black African slaves came to the USA, the expansion of African empires and the quote unquote suitability of people to that climate. Another reason is just that there was more weakly organized land in Africa. This was even more true in Eastern Europe, by the way. But like, if you're a slave raider, you wouldn't want to go to a strong organized country, say France, and try to snatch people at random, because you'd very rapidly find that first the Gendarmerie and then the French army were chasing you down to the docks, because this is a country. Even by the 1800s, there'd be signal fires warning the king's troops. And I mean, there'd be people using tools like writing and fast ships to get the word out. So slavers tended to go to areas where there was sort of weak local control. And a lot of that was the case in Central Africa. Again, that was also the case in Eastern Europe, those chaotic countries that became today's Bosnia and Czechia and so on. I mean,
aren't we seeing it now? I mean, Libya became a failed state and they have open slave markets now. So
yeah,
isn't that also a modern representation of, hey, this is what happens when everything falls apart? We get primitive, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, it's worth noting that's an interesting example, again, of what we talked earlier about, which is sort of media blind spotting. So like, yeah, there are large open slave markets on the Libyan coast. And I mean, I guess in our terms, most of the slavers would be Arabic and more than a few would be black. So, I mean, it's one of those awkward sorts of realities. I mean, it's the slavery that's occurring in public is being conducted entirely by people of color, quote unquote. And most of the people being sold in the markets are probably people of color, although I wouldn't want to be shipwrecked immediately off that part of the coast. But, you have to feel there'd be a little more attention if, for example, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people were either running the market and selling blacks or being sold as slaves themselves by the Arabs. I mean, I think we would have, in either of those cases, probably intervened already. But this is one of those ambiguous situations where we might view it as our enemies selling our other enemies or something like that, given our relationship with both North and Central Africa. We don't do anything. But yeah, where you have nation state collapse, you almost immediately see the resurgence of both slavery and feudalism. I would assume that there are very similar practices going on in parts of Afghanistan, in some of the war-torn African countries, Congo in the recent past, so on down the line. Yeah, civilization is a thin veneer over animalistic barbarism for humans, no matter what they look like.
Yeah, and I just wanted to bring that up because I feel like we're arguing over history and distant past, or, it's not so distant in the big scheme of things, but we don't have to look that far back. We don't have to look too far in any direction. There are plenty of examples right here. Good sociological studies that could be happening right now. Real-time anthropology.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And I'm sure specifically in political science or in anthropology, this is happening. But when you look at some of the academic fields like sociology and history, I mean, again, you do get that sort of selection bias. Like, most of the people are Westerners, most of them are lower upper class, most of them are very liberal. What do you choose to focus on? And I mean, you often see this sort of endless recapping of our own historical atrocities. The New York Times just ran, and I read it, I thought it was pretty well done, but then you have to ask about context. The New York Times just ran this massive article on the Tulsa race riot, or massacre, if you prefer, of 1921, showing the buildings that were burnt down, where the fighting took place, the destruction of Black Wall Street. They had 3D recreations, which must have been done in real life with actual models in some cases. I mean, just in depth. And you sometimes have to look at this stuff and wonder, why isn't there a tenth as much attention paid to things that are actually happening today? Like, why isn't there massive coverage of the Libyan slave markets, the coastal markets, or the Uyghur genocide, or a dozen other things? I mean, if you want to talk about riots, we had left and right literally fighting in the street for most of last year. I blame the left in 90% of cases, but then I have a personal bias. I mean, whatever you think.
January 6th, where the right could give back a little.
Boom. Yeah, but I mean, just like, if you want to recap something, why not, 1/6, or that situation where the the damn demonstrator set the police station on fire in Minneapolis if you prefer to come at it from the right. Like, why are we building scale models of something that happened 100 years ago when we had massive bloody riots here a couple of months ago? I said this on Twitter the other day. Like, I don't think the issue with sort of leftist journalism or social science is that it's dishonest. I mean, there's some flaws in the 1619 Project, but I don't think they just sat down there and quote unquote made shit up. I mean, but no, I don't. I think that I don't think most leftist journalism is dishonest. I
have a theory about that.
What's your theory?
Maybe I'm hanging out with too many lawyers. Oh, wait, so are you, right?
Keep them around.
My thought is that they are actually researching from a conclusion rather than to find a conclusion. And I know that sounds out there, but let's put it this way. If I say America is racist, let me prove it, I can. If I say America is not racist, let me prove it, I can. But who is just saying, what happened in America at this time? Like a blank slate. Or what's happening now? Blank slate. I'm an alien from outer space. I get dropped on the ground. What do I see? That's the kind of research that I think is lacking. I think everybody is like making a case, like a legal case, so to speak. But I could be wrong.
No, I think that's a fascinating point, actually. That's one of the more insightful. And again, this is why siloing is bad. I mean, often when I talk to people that own, for example, media companies or these sort of interviews, or talk to people in completely different fields like doctors, you do hear pretty good critiques of your own field. Most of the critiques of mine are pretty predictable, either talking about the conclusions of some of the papers, like, look, we already know war is bad. What is political science adding here? Or they're criticizing overly complex stats play, where the question is, couldn't you use these numbers at this level to find pretty much anything? You know, I am honest, but the answer to that is often yeah. But I mean, just it's a totally different perspective, regardless of whether or not some of the critiques are pretty predictable. What you just said there is an excellent point. You do have a lot of, even the idea you could refer to left or right-wing research is very problematic when you think about it. I mean,
yeah.
In reality, you know that what the Journal of Radical Philosophy publishes is going to be from the left. You know that what the Heritage Foundation publishes is going to be from the right. But in reality, and I have no problem with either of those institutions, but you shouldn't be able to guess that at all. You shouldn't be able to use what are called attitudinal practices ever, right? If you're talking about ethics, like you shouldn't be able to look at a Supreme Court justice's appointing president.
Where they're going to go. Yeah.
Yeah, it should be absolutely opaque to you. That should have nothing to do with the outcome of the damn case, which involves, railroads in the South or something like that. So I think you're right. I think most people, so they're not being dishonest. I think most people think they're being perfectly ethical, but they think they know what the truth is. Like, I'm pretty sure Antonin Scalia thought he knew what the truth was about the appropriate rate of tax in the USA, which would probably be pretty damn close to nothing. And his decisions in court cases would come from that preset baseline. So yeah, a lot of research will sort of accumulate the evidence that racism exists and is prevalent. A lot of research will sort of accumulate the evidence this is not the case. But it's very rare you see something like, for example, random selection of 8 or 9 fields thought to lean right and left, I mean, across the spectrum, and then say auditing them all to see how much bigotry actually exists, for example. So, yeah, but at any rate, I don't think that the issue is dishonesty in any sense other than the one you were using. I'm not sure we'd call that dishonesty. I don't think
that's a natural belief, same way as a child brought up in a particular church, that is their truth. And I mean, we hear a lot of that, my truth. Well, we spend time focusing from my truth to how everything fits into that picture, rather than just stepping back and saying, I'm dumb. I admit I am dumb. So I don't really have a truth. And, I think we have better odds of finding out a more realistic, nuanced story of a lost tribe in the Amazon than we do anything in our own culture, because that is so completely foreign to us. Other than what we've experienced, we'll still have our own biases and apply them to the people or whom as we discover, but odds are far better that we will be more generous with acceptance and just kind of watching and saying, they're doing this. Why are they doing that? They're doing that. Why are they doing that? Rather than just judging.
Yeah, I think that's quite likely. I mean, so there are a couple different things there. I mean, first, I do think you can get past your pre-existing biases as a scientist or social scientist simply by assuming that you have biases and trying to make everything as absolutely neutral as possible. But I don't think that many people do that. And I think that the evidence of kind of subtle bias pops up all the time and has a much bigger influence than people think it does. So, for example, not to get painfully wonky, but when I mentioned like auditing professions, right, one of the ways used to find quote unquote racial bias in today's society is to do what's called auditing. You send a team of guys who, you know, all wear the same outfit and on their resumes are listed as having the same educational background and grades and so on, but are divided by race. So say half are black and half are white, into businesses to see whether the black guys are treated differently.
Like an obviously ethnic name on some resumes versus others, and everything else is identical, just little switches in there.
Yeah, but what I found, I wrote for Academic Questions, a reason, not major, but a pretty significant from a wonk perspective, article about the audit studies. And I said I thought some of them were well done, but you really do see the role of this kind of subtle bias in terms of a lot of things. Like one would be what people look at. So the field that is audited seems to almost always be kind of like entry-level private sector jobs with mostly white-owned companies that you can find on Craigslist or some similar equivalent, like Mechanical Turk if you're just looking to find people to participate, or monster.com or whatever. And you find a pretty consistent rate of bias. Like if you're looking at, you know, who's rented a nice apartment, there's like 8% discrimination against blacks. It's, you know, it goes up from there to the ethnic name study found like 30% discrimination against Lakeisha and Jamal versus I think it was Emily and Craig or something like that. But one obvious thing that one of my friends who's a minority businessman asked me that actually inspired the article is, wouldn't it be very easy to find kind of the exact opposite? For example, if you sent in resumes to colleges or universities, either as part of the student application process or as part of an application for a job like a deanship, and you labeled one block of the identical resumes as coming from black people and another block is coming from white people, wouldn't you find, given affirmative action, that the black people would have an enormous advantage? Like at Harvard, I mean, people have estimated that the black kids...
You're Asian.
Unless you're Asian, yeah, absolutely. You're white adjacent there if you're Japanese. Or Nigerian, which is one of the oddest things I've ever heard. But anyway... But leaving aside the humor of saying that East Asians and African lords are white people if they do pass well enough on the exams, which is genuinely racist. I mean, I think what you'd find if you audited higher education is that as opposed to the 7 or 8% difference, minority applicants were something like 1,000% more likely to be accepted. I mean, I don't really think there's much doubt there. I mean, in terms of these recent lawsuits against the Ivy League and so on, what you've seen is that there's something like a 200 or 300 point affirmative action edge for minority kids. It's just we don't test that in practice. We don't see how much that would affect you if the same person is applying to the same school, but you label them differently on the basis of race. Not to go on and on with this, but like another example would be right now, 38% of businesses are owned either by minorities or by minorities and women combined. So, I mean,
especially immigrants, right? I mean, don't immigrants have a high number of small businesses or percentage?
Yeah, and now some pretty large ones as well. But yeah, if you look at anything from East Asians to South Asians, black middle class, Jews who can be counted as majority or not almost on a whim, there's no shortage of, you know, enterprises that are owned there. So what would happen if you sent someone with a black or Jewish name into the minority job application pool? Do you really feel that, you know, Bob Johnson Enterprises would discriminate against that person in favor of a blonde white guy? So it's, again, I would suspect you'd have an enormous advantage if you're applying to, say, Panda Express Corporate, not to stereotype, but you happen to be Asian Americans, a very large business, over a white dude. So, but again, that rarely seems to be looked at. So I think that the baseline of where you're starting from greatly influences what you do quite a lot. And again, I guess the unbiased version would be to across academia and across white and minority businesses see the advantage that someone would have if they were white as versus black. And I don't think you would find something like a 33% difference. I think that's what you find if you apply to private sector companies only on Craigslist in a city where 90% of the companies are owned by white people. So again, you try to be as unbiased as possible, but that requires really evaluating your pre-existing biases. And yeah, I think that there are many people that write to confirm what they previously thought. Yeah, I in fact would look at that for myself. I don't think I do it, but then how would you know? You know, do I begin with the assumption that the USA is no more or less evil than other countries, and is that itself bad? I mean, that's an interesting question.
Well, that's starting from a neutral point. At least you're seeing that everybody's equivalent. So in a way, it's a kind of a good baseline in that, because you can say, okay, all countries are equal starting zero, and then you shift accordingly. But you bring up really good points. Essentially, you're saying, wow, there's a whole lot of nuance in there. And you think of the small businesses, as you brought up, and everything else, who's going to hire? Well, a lot of it, too, is, okay, Bill Smith owns a garage. Mm-hmm. He's got a mechanic. It's probably somebody he's known for a while, maybe quit their day job, and they're working with him. They both probably are of the same race, just in general, growing up together or whatever it is. Now, Bill says, hey, I need somebody else. Do you have any relatives? Anybody you know? Well, who's going to be hired? Probably somebody that they know who might look somewhat like them wherever they are. And I don't know that that's an intentional thing to freeze somebody out, or it's kind of a natural thing that sometimes occurs.
Yeah, I think that this is where some of this gets pretty complicated. I mean, first of all, if you look at the fact 40% of businesses, 38% are minority and women owned, I'm not sure that Bill Smith is going to have a dramatically different policy there than Marcus Smith or Bill Kim. I mean, so with a lot of this stuff, one important starting baseline that I think is very relevant in terms of bias is whether you begin from the starting assumption that perfection is normal. I noticed this a lot on the left. So, I mean, when I looked at that apartment rental study, my immediate reaction was, I don't tolerate racism in my personal life. I have no Uncle Thomas traits in reality. But I mean, just when I looked at that, I said 8%. You know, I don't want to be glib, but how often does a brother apply for 10 apartments? You know, it struck me that the overwhelming majority of these young executives were getting the apartment they wanted probably on try number one. So, I mean, you had to, this kind of bias can literally only be detected in a laboratory. I mean, you had to
that's a problem too. And I've got to point it out. I meant to earlier, but yeah. I had a statistician on, and he was saying the biggest problem with a lot of statistics is they're done, all these exams of social studies and all that are done by, as he put, undergrads who need beer money. And that really skews a lot of these numbers. So I only brought that up because you said a lot of these things can only be found in a lab. Great point.
No, yeah, and so is your point, by the way. I mean, like, and there are a lot of questions to be asked about this. I don't want people to start questioning all of social science. Like, I teach our methods class, and I can answer most of the questions that would be raised by this comment. But there are a lot of issues. I mean, so first of all, many audit studies do things like, for example, placing a totally artificial criminal record on someone's resume to, simulate the effect of the fact that criminal records are more common among African Americans or something. But and they do tend to find that, you're less likely to get hired. But one obvious question is, how would that guy have done in the job market had he just presented as himself? I mean, if you're trying to make someone look like, quote unquote, archetypal black criminal, not that most criminals are black, of course they're going to have some more issues in the market. Like, what would your Yale students have looked like had they just gone out and applied as Yale students? And even what then,
would a black business owner do? I mean, let's be fair. Would a black business owner hire someone black with a criminal record quicker than a white business person necessarily?
Almost certainly not. There actually was, when you look at this stuff, no one denies there's racism or ethnic conflict between the great races, trigger warning. But I mean, when you look at this stuff seriously, you find that almost everything is pretty complicated, and you need to shed your biases and engage in real analysis to find anything worthwhile. So a lot of the things that are used to demonstrate pervasive racism don't really demonstrate anything of the sort. Like there's a claim, for example, that banks, mortgage lenders, and so on are very racially discriminatory, although for some reason they seem to prefer Asians and Jews to Anglos. But in general, they're very discriminatory against blacks. A lot of people have started pointing out, and now that there's a business academy, now there are a lot of MBAs given and so on, that to really do that study, you can't just look at the percentage of people rejected for mortgages. You have to adjust for things like income, wealth, credit worthiness, so on down the line. And when you do that, first of all, totally unpredictably, the gap's closed. I don't think anyone seriously believed that the reason Asians or Jewish Americans were beating Anglos was prejudice in favor of Chinese Americans or something like that. They had more money. But not only do you find that, you also find that black or Asian banks are more likely to play the sucker than anybody else. Like in one of these studies, the bank that had the highest rejection rate was Independence Bank. I think of Houston, like big black owned bank. And you just like, I know a lot of black businessmen, and I can just imagine the conversation on the golf course. Like, we ain't getting accused of racism. I'm not accepting any of these loan applications. These brothers need to go back to school for a few years. Like, I can just picture that conversation taking place because you have nothing to lose if you're a black bank in turning down what you think are risky loans from black people. So to really do this, again, you have to look at a series of white businesses. You have to look at a series of black businesses. What about government agencies? I would bet that because they're, for a variety of reasons, disproportionately headquartered in D.C. and the South, because they have a reputation of being friendly toward African-American applicants, I would bet that there are a huge number of black folks in most government positions, and that you might have a slight advantage if you apply there as a black guy. But again, you'd have to look at all of this. I could be wrong, but you'd have to look at all of this to really come to much of a conclusion. So that pretty much is it. Like, look at as many things as possible, adjust for as many factor variables as possible, and then you might find the truth.
You know what? That's a perfect point to end on. I definitely have a hard out. And I know that, I know you're going to be back. And you're right. I mean, we have to have 1,000 factors to look at. And next time, well, maybe you'll be on my channel. Anybody wants to check it out? It's just Eric Hunley. You can probably find it with no problem. And for now, everybody, remember, when it comes to Pete, I was never here, man. I was never here.